Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on building an integrated search strategy with Lily Ray. My name is Gerald Murphy, and I work here at Similarweb in the solutions business team, primarily for SEO. And I'm really delighted to actually introduce Lily Ray for today's webinar. Hey, Lily.
Hey there, thanks for having me.
No problem at all. Thank you very much for having us actually as well. So Lily, you're agency side at the moment and you do a lot of public speaking around, particularly about EAT content. Is that a fair summary of you?
Yes, indeed. I am the Senior SEO Director and Head of Organic Research at AMSIF Digital. So we're an agency here in New York. And I do a lot of, speaking and writing and everything, but I also kind of run the team here or help run the team. So keep them pretty busy.
Excellent. Really looking forward to speaking with you about the three core engines around the world. But first, what we'll do is just dig into a quick introduction of what Similarweb is for anyone who's on the call who hasn't heard of us before. And then we'll go into a few statistics to set the scene. And then Lily and I will start bouncing a few ideas off each other regarding how you guys can actually start to grow and succeed across Amazon, Google, and YouTube. So for anyone that hasn't heard of Similarweb, Similarweb is the official measure of the digital world. We do that by analyzing 7 different digital marketing channels across all websites in multiple countries. And just to showcase some of the data that we have, we do this across 190 countries and we've got over 1 billion search terms. So all of our data is driven by a lot of information, one of which is anonymous user behavior data, cookieless. We actually use web extensions to get that. And it really helps you to create really powerful content marketing strategies. Personally, one of my favorite types of data is our industry data. Typically, when we look at keywords, we are very specific or looking at a sample of, say, for instance, 5 websites. But actually on the platform, as we'll see shortly, you're actually able to drill into an entire industry or actually even create your own custom industry itself. So having a search strategy has never been more important, and here's why. Digital transformation is well and truly here. On this slide, what you'll see on the right-hand side is a few different stacked bar graphs. And you'll see the blue column on the far right-hand side represents Q4. What we're looking at here is the top 100 e-commerce websites in the United States. And you can see that Q4 typically is when most of the traffic comes in to websites online, especially e-commerce. Now, what you actually see is on the red line to the right-hand side of Q4, there was actually a slight dip in web traffic. So overall, digital was actually not really growing. It was remaining fairly static. And then COVID happened when we just realized that our physical behaviors needed to change. A lot more of us switched to online. And as a result, that really excelled digital transformation. So you can see on the far right-hand side in 2020, Q4 was significantly larger than any other quarter and specifically much larger than Q4 pre-COVID. Going into 2021, you can see in Q1, which is typically the lowest month, it's actually much higher than what it was in Q4 post-COVID. So really massive here, and making sure that we're understanding traffic trends and specifically what engines people are using has never been more important. The exact same story here in the UK market as well. So it's not necessarily just that it's a little handful of markets. We have found through our data that digital transformation is happening across the world, regardless of where you're actually located. Digital transformation, of course, doesn't always mean mobile in the digital world. So there are some channels that are still quite desktop heavy. So for instance, direct, when you go to a certain website like walmart.com, that's still actually much more heavily swayed towards desktop devices versus mobile. So when we're starting to speak of traffic and we're looking at search engines, definitely always looking at the two separately, but always making sure we're not just looking at one. Looking at just mobile, for example, isn't always good in the digital world. But what we'll do today is take you around how that's the case for search specifically. Now, what's really particularly interesting here is when we look at mobile, you can see on this slide, this is the United States, there's 4 desktop heavy channels in the States. You've got direct, email, referrals, and display. Whereas when you look in the UK, it's only 3. So knowing how you're performing in all of the markets you're in across the different devices individually is also really important than just looking at web traffic as a total number across your performance. Lily, any points to bring in there around digital transformation for brands specifically? Like anyone who's maybe not done search, how can they get started?
Yeah, I mean, I think one point that you raised that is really interesting, just in light of how user behavior is changing and search behavior is changing, is SEO in particular, we were so focused on mobile first, and we still are because, Googlebot has been primarily crawling as a mobile user agent. That's all switching over. But COVID and the pandemic, I think, changed a lot of user behavior in kind of the opposite direction, where I think desktop is still extremely important. And to your point, not just with SEO, but with other channels as well, desktop is sometimes a primary, driver of traffic and visibility. So I think it's important to understand, like, if you are doing a mobile first strategy for SEO purposes, that's great. Obviously, from like a technical standpoint, you should be considering those things, but don't forget about desktop. Don't neglect the desktop experience. It's still really important for omnichannel and just for your users in general.
Absolutely. So now what we're going to do is just have a look at a little analysis we did, again, just to set the scene before we go in and give you some really practical tips on how to grow your search campaigns across the big three, Amazon, Google, and YouTube. What we did in our analysis is we took the top, roughly speaking, 20,000 most clicked keywords across each of the engines individually, rolled them all up together. So we're talking about 60,000 keywords or so. And then we analyzed a range of metrics within there. So we're looking at things like search volume trends and the overlaps and differences of all of those keywords. And the results were fascinating. So when we looked at all of those keywords, what we can see on this slide is on the left-hand side, the number of searches, i.e. the search volume that happens in the United States. And then on the right-hand side, you've got the exact same data for the United Kingdom. And what you can see is on Amazon in the States, it's a much bigger search engine for these keywords. There's a massive over-reliance on terms of Amazon, and a lot of people actually do searches in the States on Amazon itself. Yes, it happens in the UK, but to a much lesser extent. In fact, 33% of people compared to the UK versus the US, search on Amazon in the United States, which is massive. YouTube is actually a bit smaller for those keywords as well, which was fascinating. But when you start looking at the UK, the split between Amazon and Google in terms of search volume is roughly more or less the same. Now, when we drill into clicks, yes, a lot of searches actually happen on Amazon in the States, but that doesn't always drive clicks. So when you're looking at Amazon Analytics, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're actually generating a lot of clicks when you see searches and traffic and so on for your products. So really not just looking at web traffic as an overall core metric, but trying to, wherever we can, drill in to any other metrics that we have available to better understand what users are behaving like online. As Lily mentioned, digital transformations made our user behavior much more complex, and really understanding those with any metrics that we get has never been more important. But what you can see on this slide is that Google is actually more trusted in the UK. That's to say there's a lot more clicks versus searches in the United Kingdom. And actually in the States, it's still a significant search engine. So what this data shows is when we're looking at just two metrics, searches and clicks, you can actually see they're vastly different. So actually what it further indicates is having a search engine strategy that accounts for all three engines has never been more important. So how do we build this search engine strategy? So what we're going to be talking about quite a lot in today's presentation is around a concept called EAT. Lily, how would you best describe EAT, and what can brands do to start actually producing EAT content?
Yeah, so EAT or EAT is an acronym that Google unveiled in its search quality rater guidelines in about 2014. And that's a document that Google uses to train its human search evaluators who basically do these experiments to see how well Google's algorithms are meeting the expectations of users. And so those tests are conducted many, many times, thousands of times around the world, all the time, and that's how Google refines its algorithms. So EAT is used in the document that trains those evaluators to give them an understanding specifically of what it means to have good and bad EAT, expertise, authoritativeness, and trustworthiness, as it relates to the website itself, the people that are creating the content on the website, the brand that's kind of owning that content. And so it's kind of an ambiguous thing where Google hasn't given us a lot of very specific information about what factors play into EAT. And I think they do that because they don't want people to manipulate these algorithms the way that SEOs tend to do. But it's, from my perspective, the single most important thing to focus on for SEO nowadays, because it's becoming increasingly clear that Google is more focused on EAT across many of its products than I think on many of the SEO signals or ranking factors of the past.
Absolutely. And also, surprisingly, a lot of brands maybe on today's call maybe haven't really thought they're doing EAT, but actually they're doing things like reviews. They have like author profiles and bios and stuff. So there may be certain aspects where brands are doing little bits of this. It's not necessarily packaged up in such a way. In terms then of those like top tips, which brands do EAT well, Lily, what would you kind of say those things are?
Yeah, that's a great point. I think it's not, a brand new strategy, marketing strategy that hasn't existed before. It's just kind of naming a lot of different tactics that brands
Yeah.
can and should be using for marketing purposes. So, with expertise, I think it's just, in many cases, you might have the expertise, but maybe you're not conveying that on your website. So making sure that you're naming the people that are writing your content or the experts that are reviewing the content, naming the people that work at the business, who's on the leadership team, who are the C levels, what are their credentials, linking those profiles to other places where people have been mentioned online. In terms of authoritativeness, this is really like how well respected and how trusted is the brand as an authority in this space. So making sure that you have obviously the right backlink profile, you can get knowledge graph results for the entities, for your organization, for the people that work at your organization. When you make a statement on the site, making sure that you're backing it up with external links to the source where it came from. And then trustworthiness is kind of the same as the above two, but just making sure you're demonstrating all the right signals that people can trust your brand. And if you're e-commerce, for example, that people feel safe making a transaction on your site.
Fantastic. So jumping in now to a bit more detail in regards to bringing it back to the search engines themselves. I think the first thing that brands need to do when they're talking about integrated search is to have a really good idea and chat internally within the organization as to who is our audience, and more specifically, which engines would our audience actually relate to, but actually tying that to resource that you have as well. So for example, we tend in SEO as an industry to focus a lot on Google, which is great because there's a lot of searches happening on there. But as we saw from the previous data, there's actually a massive opportunity on YouTube and Amazon too. But really also tying it back to, well, what are we looking to achieve with these audiences? So are we looking to engage them through videos, for example? Do we have a digital media team? In which case that would actually be a lot more pluses on the YouTube side of things as opposed to just looking at YouTube. Lily, when it comes to getting started with the identification on which engine should I look at and what sort of things should I be looking at, any guidance or advice on that?
Yeah, I think keyword research tools like Similarweb that we'll be talking about, demonstrate differences in search volumes for different queries. And I think it's really important to focus on if you type how to boil an egg or something like that, you might see vastly greater monthly search volumes on YouTube than on Google, for example, because people want video content. It's also important to remember that Google surfaces YouTube for many, many types of organic results. Even most recently, yesterday, Brody Clark pointed out that there's a new search SERP feature that's just like mini videos that Google's pulling in from YouTube. So there's a lot of interplay there because Google obviously owns YouTube. So you have to be in all those different places. And then when it comes to Amazon, as you pointed out, people often go there directly when they want to make a purchase. So if you're trying to sell products online, you have to really focus on not only being on Amazon, most likely, if it makes sense for your company, but investing in Amazon SEO because it's a different animal, and appearing in top results, as we know, is crucial to business success.
Absolutely. And that's a great point, actually, with the little mini videos experiments that's going on, because I think even towards the end of September, Google said that they were testing, trial and indexing things like TikTok and Instagram stories. So like this world, when we talk of videos, isn't necessarily just this big blob. It's actually, when you dig into it, there's a lot of opportunity in here as well. So spot on about all of those different metrics. Thanks very much. So another really good top tip to do is to naturally, because Google is massive, is to just simply do a search in real time in incognito and just see what is Google saying now as the most advanced, sophisticated algorithm, if you like, to a lot of extent across the world. We want to really start to get an idea of, well, what's it presenting and what can I learn from that? So Lily, when you see these like double bubbles, in the case here of this slide, you can see LED lights of like the Amazon double bubble, as I've called it. that sort of indicates that that term is a lot more skewed towards an e-commerce intent. Would you say that's a fair summary?
Yeah, I mean, I think Google tends to show multiple Amazon results when it's pretty clear that people want to make a purchase, or it's something that, they sell really well on Amazon, for example. So I think it's important to pay attention to that for sure, especially given that they're competitors. The fact that they're showing multiple Amazon
Absolutely.
results means it's probably somewhere you should focus.
Absolutely. And then when you do a search that is a bit more Google-like, so in the middle of the slide, you can see air conditioning unit. You've got a lot of things here, like your regular web listings. You've got people also ask. Down below the page, you'll have things like quick answers and so on. So there's a lot of different SERP features essentially on there. And that would sort of roughly indicate that that's more skewed towards Google itself. There's a lot of content opportunities on Google as one engine itself. Whereas when you're doing a search on the right-hand side for James Bond, when you see these big dominant present SERP features, in this case, things like videos, again, as Lily said, that is skewed towards Amazon for LED lights. This is the exact same here for James Bond. Lily, anything else to mention here when people are diagnosing SERPs?
Yeah, I think it's important to remember with Google as well that they're constantly refining the intent behind a keyword. So it's important to make sure that for SEO purposes, for Google purposes, that you have pages that match those different user intents, which can change from keyword to keyword. So like ballet shoes is this one example we use in the industry, where when you type ballet shoes, sometimes Google thinks right off the bat you're looking for information about it, but then maybe it sees enough user behavior shifting towards people wanting to buy it during a certain season or something like that. So maybe, you want to make sure you also have the transactional page. So, monitoring your keyword rankings and seeing how the competition kind of cycles in and out is really important for understanding user intent.
Absolutely. And funny enough, actually, what we did just earlier this year is we analyzed SERP features with Shopify. And one of the things we found through our data is Google's so sophisticated. During COVID, as soon as COVID hit, and when there was lockdown started introduced, Google Maps reduced significantly. It actually knew that this SERP feature isn't really relevant today, and people couldn't travel as much. There was very few stores open. So Google's actually definitely moving into a world where it's actually almost real time. It's trying to really understand what's the intent now. And as Lily mentioned, things like seasonality are absolutely crucial. So when you're doing this type of experiment, it shouldn't just be one off and say, oh, we've researched this. This is very heavily skewed towards Google, Amazon, YouTube. It's actually looking at this information, particularly for your largest business units, or indeed if you're in e-commerce itself, for your most sold products itself, and really getting a better idea of what is my strategy, and more crucially, which engine should my strategy be focusing on to sell more of those products that my audience currently likes. So when we start to think of this, what we want to do is to really think about what is the main aim of each of these engines. Ultimately, Amazon is all about products. So for anyone that's on the webinar at the moment, you don't sell products on your website, that's okay. It may be interesting to just have a look at the keywords that are on there, because that can help you inform your each strategy. That's to say, you're actually optimizing for a range of different terms that's going to help your user, whether or not they're actually going to convert, but just to help them actually from an educational perspective, for example. So like how to hide an air conditioning unit is potentially a good little piece or paragraph text to have on a landing page you're trying to optimize for air conditioning units. Google is a lot more heavy towards EAT. So as Lily explained earlier on, this is really about trying to get really high quality content onto your website. But also there's some secondary focuses on Google. It's massive. There's sometimes a lot of opportunities. So you can also optimize for products. You can also optimize for category pages, different SERP features like instant answers, images, and so on. And YouTube, ultimately, the main aim is around videos. So really tying up alongside your audience research you've done, alongside the SERP diagnosis you've done, really tying up, right, me, when I'm thinking about the resource that I have, which of these engines and how much time should I be spending on each of them, depending on what meets your need best. Anything else to mention, Lily?
Yeah, I think it's important to also pay attention to where Google's focus is going in recent years. And most recently, last week, they had the Search On presentation where they talked about some of the big products that they're working on and new launches and everything. And it seems very, very product focused or e-commerce focused. So it's almost like they can see the writing on the wall with Amazon and what we've talked about with how many people are going directly to Amazon to make a purchase. seems like Google's doing everything in its power to make it much easier to purchase products, not only through Google search, but through things like Google Lens as well. So different Google products that take you directly where you want to buy.
Absolutely. Fantastic points. So broadly speaking, when we look at these search engines, we can summarize them by these terms in blue on this slide. So usually we Google to find, we Amazon to buy, and we YouTube to watch. And what we want to do is what we'll show you shortly is when we're looking at our keyword strategy, it needs to be very different. So what you'll see underneath each of these little pillars on this slide is some of the core terms that are used in each of these engines. So typically when we look at air conditioning units on Google, we just type air conditioning units. We type big, broad queries. As we'll see shortly, they're sometimes called informational or awareness queries, where you and I are just, we roughly know a topic, but we're not really quite sure what exactly we want. We'll also maybe type a little few queries like air conditioning unit for a small room. But typically our search behavior is really broad, really generic. When we go to the likes of Amazon, it's first of all, yes, it's a different interface, but that actually makes us change our behavior massively. Our intent is massively different. So we don't just Google or search across all engines. We do it differently depending on what the actual engine can provide itself. So on Amazon, looking at air conditioning units, we tend to look for a lot more characteristics in the search query. So things like portable air conditioning unit, quiet air conditioning unit. We really think about the query, and as a result, making sure that that keyword strategy is very much aligned to each of those engines. On YouTube, on the other hand, it becomes actually after purchase often. So it's things like, how do I wash an air conditioning unit, or how do I hide this unit in my house? And it's really thinking about, actually, now that I've got this product, in this case, an air conditioning unit, what else do I need to do to really better use that product as well? So in terms then of succeeding in each of these engines itself, so Google best practices, making sure we're doing these three things at least, and that's technical SEO, backlinks, and EAT, eat content. And that's really going to help you start to lead the way in terms of what your Google strategy is. So Lily, when it comes to Google itself, for brands that maybe haven't done Google optimization before, any top tips you can advise on what they should be doing?
Yeah, I mean, I think the way you've visualized it with this pyramid structure is really important because you have to do all the things. Like you can't only focus on one area of SEO and expect results, especially with regard to like technical SEO. As much as a lot of SEOs love to focus on technical SEO, and it's extremely important, especially if you have a technical infrastructure that for whatever reason is preventing search engines from processing your content or crawling your content efficiently. That's really important. But I do think, the way you've laid it out here, where the EAT content and backlinks and everything are crucial as well, you have to kind of do all these things concurrently. So like my team and I, we build these roadmaps where, I would say content creation and demonstrating good EAT is probably the driving force. But at the same time, we're addressing technical problems. At the same time, we're looking for opportunities to build backlinks. So it's really important to remember that none of these things exist in a vacuum, and it all has to kind of work together concurrently.
Absolutely. And then, of course, it also depends on the size of the website. So technical audits can take a lot longer on larger websites, and therefore we want to maybe prioritize certain elements to implement over another. And one of the biggest top tips, definitely when you're doing things like technical, is what are the most common things on my site? And really prioritizing working with the web development team on fixing things that are actually going to drive things at scale, especially if you've got a lot of problems across a really large website. Other websites that are a bit smaller will maybe want to think more strategically and tactfully and actually start to identify problems that are going to take a bit longer to achieve. So that's to say, for example, thin pages, thin heavy content, where that's actually not just a case of getting a copywriter in for one day and that's all the content done. It's really thinking about what that strategy is. How can I maybe repurpose this content for another search engine, for example, as well, and really maximize and create different digital assets to really shine not just on Google, but actually just across the web more broadly. And ultimately, the main aim of EAT, of course, is to generate good content signals. So, of course, backlinks are included there where other bloggers are talking about you and linking to your website. And in Google's eyes, that's almost like an endorsement or a vote, if you like. But other really good signals on there to be looking at as part of your general analytics analysis of websites is things like, what are my engagement metrics? Which pages do I have really high bounce rates on? Is that content good? Have I got an each strategy there? Am I actually looking at how can I further improve that page? Does that page, for example, have a really poor load time? And you can see that these different things can always weave in across each other. So Lily summarized it really well. To do really fantastically on Google is actually not just doing one of these things, it's making sure we're doing all three at least. So definitely, in terms of your Google strategies, always focus on all three throughout the year. Lily, when it comes to like prioritizing this throughout the year, do you recommend, do we do technical SEO maybe twice a year? Is it something we look at on a regular basis?
It's completely dependent on the site itself. So we get some clients, like we have a very big e-commerce client right now, for example, where technical SEO is much, much more important than anything else
Mhm.
because of the amount of technical problems that they have and it's how long it's going to take to fix a lot of them. So for that site, I would say it's the most important thing to prioritize, especially before the holiday season and everything like that. For other clients, let's say they built, a brand new WordPress website, it's using a modern theme, maybe performance is good. There might not be that many technical SEO issues to deal with, but building out content and links might be much more of a priority for that site. So it's completely case by case. But I would say you have to prioritize based on how much value you'll get from the strategy. So I think one kind of mistake that a lot of SEOs made in the past year was overemphasizing something like Core Web Vitals, which Google said wasn't going to be the huge ranking factor at the cost of focusing on something like backlinks and content. And now that Google's rolled out, the page experience update, people are saying, well, it didn't have that big of an impact. It's like they told us that would happen. So just understanding how much weight these things carry and investing your time accordingly.
That's a fantastic point again. Yeah, never run away with one update. It's always about that multiple proactive approach. Now, on the other hand, of course, Amazon does have content to it. So, for example, it has product listings. It's got things like a product description. You've got a title on there. So there is certain elements on here which can overlap when it comes to content. But actually, I know, Lily, you've done Amazon optimization before in the past. It isn't always the case that an EAT approach on Amazon, it always works like that.
I think Amazon, first of all, it doesn't use obviously the word EAT in its own documentation. I don't know that it even has a notion that's similar to what Google uses for EAT. I think Amazon is so focused on selling products that the algorithms prioritize whichever product sells the most and whichever product best meets user experience in terms of them coming back and buying again or whatever the case may be. So I don't know that it's as important, like the trustworthiness of a brand or anything like that. But I do think, as you have written here, there's things like seller trust and people's experience buying from certain merchants or certain sellers. So in that sense, it's EAT. But in the sense of having like really great trustworthy content on your A+ page or something, I don't think that plays as big of a role as it does on Google.
Absolutely. But it definitely doesn't do any harm if you're reselling a manufacturer's product to like tweak that content, make it different, make it unique, and really think about trying to think about like how can you incorporate, for example, some questions that people ask into your actual content so that they don't need to scroll down and read that, help
Sure.
actually people to educate those and stuff too. And then of course, keyword relevancy. It's massively different as we saw previously around air conditioning units, making sure that we're not just looking at Google keywords. We've done research on Google and we're just copying and pasting that for Amazon. That approach isn't really going to work because our behaviors, as mentioned earlier, are massively different. But on Amazon, interestingly, it's about before and after product purchase. So as you'll see on this slide on the top pillar, seller trust and customer satisfaction / retention, it's also things around like gaining reviews. So once someone buys your product, you want them to actually authentically give you a review that's actually again unique out there, so you're not just getting the same review over and over again. That looks really spammy and it doesn't create a lot of trust for the seller. But actually other metrics that are used by Amazon themselves is, for example, a low order defect rate. They don't want to really promote people who sell a lot of products but they get a lot of returns. That doesn't really work for Amazon themselves. They've got delivery drivers who are doing this on their behalf, and there's a big logistics system around the back as well. And answered questions, really responsive, try and almost do it in real time. If someone asks you, try and answer it. But as mentioned before, try and go above and beyond. How can you incorporate some of that information into even better informational, educational content on, for example, your product description, so that people can really get to better grips as to how this product is going to be useful for them in their real life? Anything else to add there, Lily?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're focusing on Amazon SEO or Amazon marketing, it's very important to do some research and get to understand the algorithms that Amazon uses because they're very different than Google. I was pretty surprised when I started working on Amazon SEO, like, oh, that's what worked on Google 10 years ago, but doesn't work on Google anymore. So it's important to understand those nuances and to understand that what might be a best practice on Google, where Google's using much more sophisticated natural language processing and has a much greater ability to understand content. With Amazon, it might be a little bit more literal, like just making sure that the right keywords are in the right places. So just understanding the different algorithms is going to be really important to your success.
Great stuff. So YouTube then is much more about engagement. So as we looked at previously, we've got Google, which is the bigger strategy where it's a multi-layered approach. Amazon is much less content, but actually around things like the order defect rate. YouTube is ultimately about engagement. They're trying to really work out what videos would people like to watch, because ultimately they're trying to look at metrics, things like how much of this video has someone watched? Have they just watched the first 15 seconds? That's not as good as watching the full duration of the video, for example. So really getting into engagement is key here. So at its brilliant basics, we want to be looking at metrics like, for example, views, likes, number of subscribers, number of comments, if enabled, that video gets, because that can be an indirect way as well to YouTube, which is an engine, of course, to really work out, does the audience love this content? Is this actually useful? Is it different? And so much so that they're actually liking it, they're sharing it and so on, which brings us on to the middle pillar around actually enabling sharing options under the settings space. So people can, for example, embed your video somewhere on their own website, or indeed that actually video and page itself can generate backlinks to your website, which will support your Google strategy. So there's definitely an intertwining here. But the biggest thing from a resource perspective is actually having the resources to produce the videos itself. Any other top tips you can recommend, Lily, for YouTube or video optimization?
Yeah, there's a lot of different features on YouTube itself when it comes to uploading a video that you want to make sure you're checking all those boxes. So things like timestamps, which Google pulls in for key moments, hashtags, links to your website or your key pages in the description. Just kind of like leveraging all those features because they do evolve over time. And then I think, to the point before about having a separate strategy or a separate understanding of Amazon, just understanding how search behavior is different on YouTube, which we've talked about, because you might have a completely different search volume for something on YouTube than you would on Google. So your keyword priorities might be completely different.
Absolutely. So what we need to do is to really bring this together. So far we've looked very much in isolation and talked, roughly speaking, of overlaps, but really the thing that brings all of these engines together is keyword intent in the buyer's journey. So historically, we looked at keywords as being informational, navigational, transactional. In other words, to defined, to get, or to actually buy. Now, what we're doing is moving on towards a buyer's journey phase where we've got four different sections to it. You've got awareness, consideration, decision, and inspiration. And ultimately, what we're trying to do is to really tie each of these off. So when we speak of informational awareness, that's those big broad terms that you and I haven't really thought about. So for example, air conditioning unit, they're typically really, really broad. And yes, they can bring in and have a lot of searches and potentially have a little bit of traffic on the back of them. They're very unlikely to convert with you as a brand or actually help drive your engagement metrics like number of pages viewed per session, average session duration, and so on. Navigational typically is when people tend to just go to amazon.com, amazon.co.uk. They go and have a look. What's the latest deals? Oh, let me just go in and look for portable air conditioning units, those sorts of things. Transactional is when we're going to do something, we're going to usually buy or sign up, for example, for a white paper on a website, those sorts of things. And typically that's very much skewed towards Amazon. Consideration is super interesting because it's in the middle of the buyer's journey where the searcher doesn't know exactly what they want to do. But if they were to find a really good page with really good content on it that actually has things that are relevant to that particular query, they're more likely to convert, or actually they may actually go automatically on the same session from the consideration phase to decision, where they're actually going to then later on go and convert. And inspirational is definitely all around YouTube. So things as we saw earlier on, like how to hide a washing, an air conditioning unit, those sorts of things are super useful. So when it comes to keyword intent and stuff and the different behaviors we have, Lily, any best practices, advice, comments on that?
Yeah, I think it's really important when you're building out, like we call it a keyword matrix at our agency, but it's basically like what are all the different keywords or keyword sets that we're focusing on and what is the associated intent as much as possible, kind of mapping that out with the keywords, because one of the things you'll see that I think Google is getting more aggressive about is the blending of intents for purposes of trying to increase like your sales or something like that. So let's say, you have an article about 5 best mattresses for side sleepers or something. And you can see in the results that most of the ranking articles are 90% informational. It's people that have reviewed the products and tested it out, and they're just providing great insights for people that are at that discovery phase of the buyer's journey. But then if you try to push too hard within the content, buy this, click this ad, click this product, and it's overwhelming. I think that can ding you from an SEO standpoint. A lot of people have done too much of that in the past. So just understanding that there's a time and place for the user just wants information. They just want you to help them during this part of the process. And then later when they're ready to buy, there might be a separate section or separate page on your site, and keeping them kind of separated whenever you notice that that's what Google's prioritizing, I think is really important.
Fantastic. So what we want to do now is, before we show you just how Similarweb and specifically can help you identify these keywords and how to categorize, just to summarize everything up so far, we want to make sure we're really aware of search engine differences and similarities. So when it comes to Amazon, it's definitely about e-retail. It's about people actually buying products. Google is all around EAT, and YouTube is all around video engagement. But remember the brilliant basics. They are 3 different engines. We also want to make sure we've got 3 different analytics set up. So in the case of Amazon, for example, we've got Amazon Seller Central, as they call it, which is basically your analytics of how you're performing on Amazon itself. On Google, for instance, you may want to use Google Analytics or Adobe Analytics, those sorts of things. And then also having a really good keyword strategy, as we're going to show you quickly how to start that. It's making sure at minimum we're looking at the 4 stages of awareness, consideration, decision, and inspiration to really start to understand what are the behaviors. And then, of course, making sure we're EAT centric. So we're really thinking about not just producing content for the sake of it, it's actually making sure it's of value. We're not just randomly updating a landing page, or every year, for example, for a certain product, we're not just randomly creating another page when it's actually more or less the same. That's kind of the things that doesn't really help Google or indeed the searcher itself. Lily, anything else to add there?
Yeah, no, I think it's great to take a step back and think about an integrated search strategy that thinks about more than just one search engine. And maybe as you're doing keyword research, collecting data from the different search engines, and then you can kind of have, again, like a matrix or a database that says, these are the terms that we're focusing on. We think that we should use both YouTube and Google for this keyword or this topic. I think a lot of SEO agencies don't think that way, even though it's all organic search. This is all things that can drive organic traffic. So
Absolutely. And then, of course, to eat your way through, that's the thing. It definitely does touch on all of this in some shape or form, some to a lesser extent. So as Lily mentioned on Amazon, it can be much more biased towards some of the basic things. So like the keyword you have and the title, does it appear in the first line of the first paragraph? Those sorts of old school Google tactics, if you like. Whereas Google is really much more sophisticated today and really trying to get a better understanding of what would suit the search today. Is there seasonality involved? Is there actually, for example, anything going on in the news relating to something? It's really trying to better understand real-time behaviors to present you ideal information in that actual moment itself. So now what we want to do is to really make sure we're aligning keyword research and user behaviors together. So broadly speaking, we've got 6 different behaviors. And actually, this is where EAT content can really massively play its part. So one of those is called pearl growing. And that's when you and I, as a searcher, do a search for a term that we're not really sure all about that. We need to learn a little bit more. And that's where EAT really helps us shine, because it's got that expertise, the trustworthiness, the in-depth material regarding a product. it really actually helps educate the searcher. And what that stops them doing is this behavior called pearl growing, where they look at a document, they then look at results, and then they reformulate a query. What you're trying to do is to really keep them into your own website and really educate them through your own brand, building up that trust, that authority with the particular brand itself. And then, of course, we've got some technical things like, for instance, filters, and that's all around pogo sticking. We don't just pogo stick. That means when we do a search, a really good search, we type a good query, we see a really good search result, and then we just go to and from different results. We actually can pogo stick, for instance, within the website. So we can use things like color filters, size filters for shoes, for instance, and that's really building up that further trust. So there's a lot of similarities when we look at behaviors, particularly with EAT, to really, really try and see how can we capture the user. But to do that, we need to think of the user, and don't be all lost when people do leave your website. We all need to quit at some point. We have to do a phone call. We have to make dinner. Every search has to end. And of course, that also brings a point when we're looking at different devices and behaviors. Good mobile abandonment is much higher on mobile naturally than desktop. So when you're looking at things like bounce rates and so on, just because the bus arrived or the coffee came and we're doing a search on mobile, it doesn't necessarily mean that content wasn't good or that search wasn't good. It just means that in the moment we had to end that search. So making sure we've got a really good idea of these different behaviors and aligning those as well wherever we can with how do we do things on the website differently, whether that's do more technical through applying more filter options, whether it's actually writing more educational content to enable things like pearl growing. And that really, really captures that user behavior to be front and center of any content that's produced. And we often in SEO always ignore brand, not necessarily ignore it. We don't really talk about it much. When we do keyword research or do types of analysis, we always are much more biased towards non-branded terms. But actually, it's fascinating when you look at some of the metrics. So one of the metrics unique to Similarweb is what we call zero click, which basically means that people don't click on anything on Google at all. And that includes PPC results as well as organic. And what you'll see here is people, when they do a search for Facebook as a branded term, 15% of them zero click. So what that would suggest is basically most people do a search for Facebook to find the Facebook page. That's what's called a navigational query. And that's really, really worthwhile knowing. So looking at your branded zero clicks to better understand how are people finding your brand and what do you need to do to better optimize your brand for those things. But what's super interesting is when you look at Google, 80% of people zero click. In other words, people realize they're in Google and they actually maybe just go back and maybe go google.com, for example, and actually do a search for that. So there's a lot of different behaviors here, and looking at these different metrics can really help you understand what's going on. But it's super interesting because when we start looking at some non-branded terms, they have very, very similar patterns. So for example, when you do a search for Duvet, as we saw previously with Google, it has a lot of zero clicks. In other words, we don't click on many results at all. There's only such a small percentage of us click on anything after doing a search for that. And this is an example of an awareness keyword where you and I are actually a really bad searcher and haven't really given thought to what size is my bed, what color scheme do I want to go for. We haven't specified those in the query. And that's typically when we go back and reformulate our query. Whereas when you look at things like duvet cover sets on the top right-hand side, it's 43% zero click. It's actually a much better keyword to rank well for because people are more likely to go and click on your website. So looking at just search volume alone isn't very effective when you're doing keyword research. It's making sure we're thinking of user behaviors, and wherever we can, we're looking at metrics like, for example, zero click. Anything else to add, Lily?
Yeah, I think this is extremely important, especially in light of Google's ever-changing SERP features and new product launches that they are, unleashing, like, updates to Google Merchant Center and Google Shopping and everything. You have to make sure that you're not just focused on, again, search volume, because you want to see what's the distribution of those clicks. Where are those clicks going? Are they going to Google Shopping? Are they going to YouTube? And kind of understanding that distribution can help you allocate, like, a video always appears when we type XYZ keyword, and people generally always click into YouTube because that's what Google's prioritizing in the search results. So YouTube might be a better focus for that keyword than trying to get one of the 10 blue links, for example.
Super stuff. So now very quickly, we're just going to take you through a little bit of Similarweb's platform just for a few minutes to show you roughly how this can actually support what we've been talking about today. So in here, what we have is a thing called keyword generator. And what we do is when we have keywords, we actually look at them very distinctly. So we have a keyword database for Google, a separate one for Amazon, and a separate one that we've just recently launched actually for YouTube. And this allows you to do keyword research specifically for a search engine. So when we, for instance, go on Google and in keyword generator, and in this case, we're looking at desks, you can see actually the search results are quite generic. These are all what would be called awareness types of terms. So for instance, the most popular keyword in desks is desks, where there's quite a significant amount of searchers in the United States, of course, on desktop. You've also got mobile as a different metric if you want to analyze that too. But you'll see actually a lot of these results have a lot of zero clicks. So they're often at around 50% or so. So really what we want to be doing is not just looking at search volume itself all the time. And we want to really start thinking about, right, if someone does a search and finds my page, what page would I want them to find? That's the page you want to optimize that keyword for. But crucially, can I meet their needs? Am I going to keep them into my website? Am I going to satisfy their information needs? But also the other thing you want to be looking at is the search engine results page behavior itself. And that's where zero click can be really, really handy to come in, because this can actually be a nice little way to actually identify high intent keywords as well, which can really, really support you going forward. Now, when you look at, for example, standing desks as a keyword, again on Google, what you'll see is you're getting a lot more specific results. These actually have a much higher intent. You're seeing much less 50% here in terms of zero click, but you're also seeing a lot of really highly search volume terms as well. And also remembering the brilliant basics, so seasonality of certain terms. Not all keywords and not all products have the exact same seasonality. There are certain products themselves that have very, very different seasonality trends. So making sure that that's also considered when you're looking at your content strategy. And what's fascinating is when we look at different engines. So if we put the same term in Amazon, you can actually see our search behavior is massively more specific. We're really looking for things like small desks for small spaces. So we're actually really trying to understand and get a product to meet a particular need. Whereas as we saw previously, when you're looking on Google, it's a lot more generic terms. So really thinking about what is that keyword strategy for each of my engines has again never been more important. And then on YouTube, things like desks, we're really interested in things like good desks and gaming setups. We want to get a bit of inspiration, but not always throughout the year. So there are certain times and places when we want to promote these videos through different channels, different ways of actually getting people to find these, and actually making sure that we're thinking about when is the best time to write content around this topic, but also when is the best time to promote it. And that's definitely where a content calendar and those types of things can be incredibly valuable. Or as Lily mentioned earlier, things like the matrix, which is looking at all of these engines themselves and having that approach. Again, when we look at air conditioning unit, you can see on Google, it's actually fairly generic. You've got a few retailers here in the United Kingdom. So you've got some e-commerce websites like, for instance, Argus, and so on. And what you're basically seeing here is fairly generic queries. But when you start looking at things like Amazon, you'll see again, way more specific compared to desks even. So it's not just to say, okay, this generally happens on this engine. It can differ, which is why we recommend, especially for your most popular business unit, to really have a deep understanding of keyword behaviors there, especially if you've got a smaller team. But actually, if you've even got a smaller team, again, it's making sure you've got this keyword research nailed down for your highest converting products itself. Because on Amazon, our behavior is looking at really specific features like wall mounted. We're even looking at, for example, particular units of air conditioning units. We're looking for extension hoses. We're looking for a range of different keywords here. And then again, when you look on YouTube, you'll see that that behavior and content is massively different. We're actually looking to how to reduce noise from an air conditioning unit. So maybe we've bought one, we found out, oh, it is a little bit noisy. How can we actually advise brands on other things to do as well to do that? So looking at a range of metrics The brilliant basics are search volume, looking at clicks, zero-click behavior, as well as the seasonality of those searches so that you can create a really effective content strategy throughout the year. Anything else to add there, Lily?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is so revealing to see all the different nuances and specific ways that people search on different search engines. And it's really important to understand, again, like with Amazon, knowing that people are typing those very specific like specs about the product or anything like that, you have to go into your Amazon product pages and make sure that you're including those terms, but those terms might not be as important in your YouTube description, for example, where somebody just wants to know how to position their air conditioning in the window or whatever the case may be. So having that data by platform is really important, because I think a lot of business owners assume that whatever is the highest volume keyword for Google is the one that they should be focusing on everywhere, but that's not always the case.
Perfect, beautifully summarized. So to bring it all back, we want to make sure when you're doing keyword research, we're looking at all 4 pillars of the buyer's journey. So awareness is when the searcher doesn't know what they really want. So for example, paper is a good example of awareness. They're not really sure, is it wallpaper, is it printer paper? Whereas when someone explicitly says things like printer paper, that's much more of a consideration term. Searchers are a little bit closer to what they want, but they're not exactly sure of, like, for example, in this case, what size of paper do they want? So things like decision would be things like A4 printer paper, where the searcher is a lot more specific. They have a need. They want something to meet that need, and therefore they're more likely to interact with you as a brand. And inspirational could be something completely outside the box. So when you're looking at printer paper, it could be how to make an airplane out of printer paper. So it's actually not the traditional use or primary use of that product. It's actually going and doing a different spin on it, of which case actually that could be really useful, for example, for YouTube. So just to summarize again how the data can be used, you've got here Duvet cover for Amazon. You can see here on Amazon, it's a lot more skewed towards awareness and consideration terms. 18 of the 20 keywords are relating to consideration. So that's maybe when they've thought a little bit about it. So for example, single duvet cover, but they haven't really thought about what color do they want, those sorts of things. That would be what we call a consideration term. Again, remember, we're looking at search volume and clicks, as well as paid versus organic split whenever possible. When it comes to, for example, Google, you can actually see that there's a lot more branded activity on here for duvet covers, as well as a little bit of awareness and consideration. So again, making sure we're looking at all of these different keywords and having a really good strategy. And definitely one of the things for Google to win on is zero-click information. Then you've got YouTube. YouTube is such a vast range and can often provide a lot of opportunities that actually meets various stages of the buyer's journey. So in the case here of duvet cover, for example, you can be optimizing for things like how to quickly put on a duvet cover, how to quickly make a bed. Those sorts of things can be really, really useful on YouTube, but also to embed in as part of your Google strategy in a blog post, for example. So really, really thinking about all of those different ways in which you can integrate that strategy across. So in summary, before we open it up for Q&A, the 3 ways in which you need to succeed across an integrated search strategy from Amazon, Google, and YouTube is to be engine-led, really looking at search engine specific metrics, the brilliant basics of search volume, of clicks, of web traffic, of what's the web traffic across the different devices. To have a content-led strategy, which is making sure that we're not just producing low quality content that's already out there. It's making sure that it's very EAT focused. And then of course, making sure that that's user-led, where we're thinking about the buyer's journey and keyword intent. And more specifically, we're categorizing our keywords by that intent of awareness, consideration, decision, and inspiration. Anything else to add there, Lily, before we open up for Q&A?
No, I think you covered it pretty well.
Super stuff. So let's see what someone has. In fact, Avi's already been answering. Yes, there will be a copy of the presentation going forward after, especially given that you guys have signed up. And see, sorry, I'm getting into the chat now too. Any recommendations around other engines? So for example, Pinterest has been mentioned, Lily. So like, when is it a case that brands should be looking at social media and the different medias themselves?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. I've talked a lot in a different like research that I've done and talks that I've done about Pinterest, because it seems to be the case that for certain keywords, Google relies really heavily on Pinterest and some other stock photography websites to show up in top results.
Hmm.
And it's almost like, Google can trust these sites to have better pictures than maybe it has in its own index or whatever. So I think Pinterest is a really important place to focus if you're a visual brand, or if you're doing things like creating infographics or custom imagery, you should have them there as well, because you never know when Google's going to decide. Like last year, for example, Pinterest used to take up like 8 of the 10 organic results for certain queries. So you should definitely be on there just for the organic traffic alone.
Absolutely brilliant. And for anyone then that hasn't started that digital matrix as regards to their keyword research, any best practice or things they can do to really start to get that done?
Yeah, I mean, I think, using a tool like Similarweb that surfaces the different search volumes across different search engines is going to be really important to document all that data. All the other KPIs that you talked about today, like percentage of zero click, obviously, search volume, anything that's like regional, classifying intent as much as possible, and what SERP features appear for the keyword is going to be really helpful for you to make a decision about what type of content you should target for that keyword.
Fantastic. So thank you very much again for everyone, and especially for you, Lily, for taking part in today's webinar. Really, really appreciate it massively. And I hope everyone's enjoyed the content, and really looking forward to working again with you very soon.
Thanks so much.
All the best.